Okay, so I do just want to make sure that folks online are hearing us okay. Justin, can you give me the thumbs up? Perfect. Okay, great. So hi, everyone online. I'm going to be mostly off screen as I speak to the live audience, and Megan, when she hops in to start talking, she'll come over and say hello to you as well. But again, you're mostly going to be staring at this poster behind me, but hopefully visual for the slides are good. If anything comes up, we'll be checking back in to make sure Justin will let us know if there are any issues coming up. So to get started, as Nancy said, we're hearing from folks, and again, this is not working already. There we go. Okay, so we heard from folks that people wanted to hear about predators in Massachusetts, more specifically large predators. So that's what we're here to do today. We'll start out with just a couple of quick introductions. My name is Sue McCarthy. I'm a wildlife biologist. I work for the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, or Mass Wildlife, we're known for short, out of our field headquarters office. The vast majority of work that I do is in regards to the management and conservation of game species, so those species that can be hunted and trapped. And most of what I'm doing has to do with collection of harvest data or harvest reporting information, population monitoring, hunter surveys, and dealing with cleaning, monitoring, managing data to ultimately manage those game species. And then when I'm not doing one of the very many job duties related to managing game species, I'm usually working with the general public, whether it's doing something like this, like a presentation, outreach, education type materials, but more often responding to public inquiries about human-wildlife interactions. So I'll pass over to Megan for your intro.
Perfect. Hi, everyone online. I'm Megan Crawford, and similar to Sue, I'll be kind of out of frame every once in a while. I'll try and pop back over and say hi to our online audience here. But so my name is Megan Crawford, and I am the community engagement biologist at the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. I've been in this role for a little bit over a year, and it's a totally new role to the agency. And as you can probably guess, a lot of my job is doing exactly this, is talking with the public, having conversations with people or groups or organizations, helping build a little bit of a relationship, a little bit of trust, and doing some education. So conducting outreach, maybe that's like presentations, but that's also some of our online materials that people might want to just Google a quick question about the wildlife in their backyard. And part of my job is making sure people are finding the answers and feel like they can learn about the wildlife here in Massachusetts and how to live alongside of it, of course. And kind of similar to Sue, as well as I respond to a lot of the public inquiries that may come in. So that might just be an individual that's calling to report a sighting, or because they're excited about something, or maybe they're nervous about seeing a certain wildlife. And so helping them with that. And then, of course, responding to any media inquiries too. So it certainly keeps me busy, but it's quite fun. I think next we're hopping into our mission. So how many of you have heard of Mass Wildlife before? Massachusetts. Oh, love to. Okay, all of our friends in the room raise their hand. I'm hoping we have some virtual hand raise out there as well. But we do find that people kind of confuse us a bit with DCR, so it's always helpful to kind of point it out. Makes total sense. We do a lot of kind of overlapping work, but what we're responsible for is the conservation of freshwater fish and wildlife across the state of Massachusetts, and that does include endangered plants and animals as well. And then on top of that, we also work to restore and protect and manage land for wildlife to thrive and for people to enjoy it. So I think that's a pretty inspiring mission, pretty neat, and it's a joy to do. And then if you're not familiar with where we are, how many of you have been into one of our offices before, into one of our district offices? Okay, we got maybe a couple hand raises here, beautiful. How about anybody on our wildlife management areas that are managed by us? Okay, cool. Okay, a couple more hands there then. So me and Sue, we work out of our headquarters, which is in Westboro, so central Massachusetts. But then we got some other stars on there too, because we have, of course, our district offices that cover the state. So we kind of break out our state into 5 districts. We have our Western district, which our office is in Dalton. We have our Connecticut Valley one, which is here in Belchertown. Oh, nice, look at that. We have our central office, which is in Boylston. We have our northeast. Oh, well, I guess that's headquarters. That's where Sue and I are at. And then that up there is our Northeast District office in Ayer. We do technically, I think, have a Boston office-ish. I wouldn't pop into it. I don't think it's open to the public. Yeah. Exactly. And then we have our Southeast District office, which is in Bourne. So that helps us kind of spread across the state and support our constituents everywhere. And then we have our little blue fish that represent our hatcheries that we run too. Yeah. And then all those green dots are our land. So if you haven't had a chance to look at our wildlife management areas, you can see they're well across the state. You could check those out too. And this is just a little bit of what we're going to be covering today. So again, the title of our presentation is Massachusetts Predators of the Past and Present. So you could probably take a guess as to some things we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to kick it off by talking about some historic predators that were once here in Massachusetts. And then we're going to move into more of those present day predators, more common predators here in Mass. We're going to, of course, touch on some tips for coexisting with that common wildlife here in our state. And then we'll end it with some Q&A, which we'll start again with our questions in the room, and then we'll hop over to our virtual friends to see if there's any questions there that we didn't hit. So it should be a good time. And I guess we're gonna keep going. I think this is still me, so we're gonna pop on over. So I figure we'll maybe start with just kind of laying the groundwork for what type of wildlife we're gonna talk about today, because we were only given like 45 minutes to present. So we got to kind of keep ourselves into some sort of scope of what we're going to chat about. And so today we're going to talk about specifically mammalian predators. So mammalian predators. So maybe for our friends in the room and our friends online, you can think about this too. Is anybody willing to share, like, what are some words that come into your mind when you hear mammalian predator? Like, what type of animals do you think we're talking about? What kind of traits do those animals typically have? Yeah. Oh, so our friend in the room was thinking a bobcat is thinking one of those mammalian predators. Absolutely. Fox, bear, coyotes. Absolutely. Yes. Fishers. Yep. Lovely. We're calling all animals with fur. That's excellent. That's a good start. Wolverine, we don't have those here in Massachusetts, but it is a mammalian predator. You're absolutely right. Mountain lion. We'll be talking about mountain lions today. Now, deer are mammals, so that certainly fits into that first word there, but not so much predators. They're usually on the other side of that, which is being prey. But maybe we'll hop to the next slide just to remind ourselves of these things. So mammals, they have backbones, so they're vertebrates. They have hair or fur, quite shown by the many furs and pelts that we have on our table in house today. They're endothermic or warm-blooded, often referred to. They produce their own body heat, and they feed their young with milk. So that's kind of thinking about those mammal side of things. But then predators, those are the animals that hunt and eat other animals. And there's some traits that predators have that you could kind of quickly look at and go, okay, yeah, that animal probably eats another animal. And so if we take a look at our bear skull here, which I'll show our online audience. Hopefully this isn't too jarring. I'll show my face first. And then we do have our bear skull here. So thinking about predators, what they need to do is they need to find their food, and then they need to catch and hold on to their food, and then they need to tear apart their food. So finding their food, you can just look at their eyes, right? That's going to tell you about how what this animal eats. Predators have forward-facing eyes, so you can see those eyes right forward facing, just like us as people, eyes in front, ready to hunt, eyes on the side, ready to hide. Prey usually have eyes towards their sides. So you have this bear hopping right in front, they'd be able to see you nice, which helps with their depth perception, helps them catch things. And then the other thing, right, they need to be able to catch their food, tear it apart, eat it, digest it. So you can look at their teeth, right? Predators often have nice, large, pointy canines, which no surprise here. We got some nice, large canines to see. Pretty impressive. So easy things that you could take a look at even from a distance, potentially. But I think that's my part for now. And now I'm going to pass it back to Sue to kick us off with our first part about those historic predators.
Not have pockets. All right. So as Megan noted, we'll start with historic mammalian predators. of which there might have been a few different species, but we've got two, the two big ones that people always kind of want to hear about. So before we get into talking about those two species that existed here historically, just wanted to set the groundwork for some terminology here. So a word that we use all the time as biologists in referring to animals that no longer exist here is extirpated or extirpation. So extirpation is when a species no longer has the established population in a specific range that it used to inhabit. So its historic range, it's no longer existing in that historic range. And extinction is quite a bit more final in that that species no longer exists anywhere in the world where it once existed. And then just kind of a side note is that, there are species and then there are subspecies, multiple subspecies. And so it's possible for a subspecies to go locally extinct. So the species itself might exist elsewhere in the world, but a subspecies of that species might become locally extinct. And that is the case with the species that we're going to be talking about first, which is the mountain lion, puma, cougar, catamount, panther. It's got a number of common names, but this is all the same species. So this animal once ranged throughout most of North America, including Massachusetts. And the general description, this is a very, very large animal, so 6 to 8 feet in length. That includes a very long J-shaped tail. And weights range anywhere 65 to 260 pounds. That's quite a weight range. So females are generally going to be quite a bit smaller than males. And also that weight range kind of takes into account those different subspecies of cougar. So generally in colder, more northern climates, mammals tend to be larger bodied, and warmer, more southern climates, they tend to be smaller. So quite a weight range there. But all of these, this species and all of the subspecies, they all have this short tan coat. They've got a white muzzle and a white chin. And unlike some of the other native feline species that are in North America, they do not have a prominent face ruff, which we'll see a little bit later when we talk about bobcats. So this range map here shows in orange the current range of mountain lions. And the green, which overlaps with that orange, is all of the historic range where this species once existed, but no longer does. So you'll see Massachusetts is part of that historic range. And also note that for current range, again, the orange, the only spot east of the Mississippi is in Florida. That's the Florida panther, which you may have heard of. That is an example of a subspecies of the mountain lion. And they are a very highly endangered and genetically corrupt species. So they may not be with us for a whole lot longer because they're genetically, they're just not really a very viable, healthy population. So where did mountain lions go? They were here historically. What happened to them? Like all, unfortunately, predator species, or any wildlife species really that were posing any kind of a threat to colonists, whether it was to their livestock, whether it was in competition for game that colonists were hunting themselves, or if colonists felt that an animal posed any kind of a threat to human health and safety, those animals were very heavily persecuted. And colonial states actually offered bounties on these animals. So it was considered your civic duty to actively lethally remove these animals, mountain lions and other large predators, and essentially any predator on the landscape that was posing those perceived risks, or in some cases real risks. So due to that persecution and the bounty, and in addition to that sort of indiscriminate killing side of things, there was also drastic changes to the landscape, drastic changes to other wildlife resources and habitat types as given European settlement. And all of that culminated in mountain lions becoming extirpated from Massachusetts. And then the last known Massachusetts mountain lion was killed around year 1858. So now we're at a point where the species no longer exists in viable populations anywhere in the US east of the Mississippi, again, with the exception of the Florida panther, which is imperiled, if you will. And there's currently no established population of mountain lions here in Massachusetts or anywhere in New England. That doesn't mean, though, that we don't frequently get reports of mountain lions in Massachusetts. So it is a widely held belief that there are mountain lions in Massachusetts, even though we know we don't have resident population. But again, we get these reports all the time. We get calls from the public, emails, all sorts of stories in person when we speak to the public, and more now than ever, we're getting. Oh yeah, but I was just going to say just the fact that everyone has a cell phone with a camera and are able to take video. Most of the time, these reports are accompanied by some type of video or photo evidence, like this one. And so, I want to see if I could play that again for you. There we go. So you'll see this is a video someone had sent in, said, we saw a mountain lion, got video of it. And obviously they're seeing what's a pretty large bodied animal. But you can see right at the end of this little video clip that there's a little tail flick, and you can see it's a short, stubby little tail. And also if you're considering the height of this, being probably waist height, a railing, right? Then you can get an idea of the general size of this animal. And it's a bobcat, right? So here's another example. This is one of those ring videos that more and more people have. And you see this animal walk by, and there's not a whole lot in here for reference for size, but you can see kind of how it compares as it walks fairly close to the vehicle there. You can get an idea of its size. But it also, and I want to play this a couple of times because the quality of the video, it's kind of blurred a little bit, right? And it almost looks like there's a long tail. And that's really when this person sent this video in, that's kind of what they were honing in on. But if you watch the video enough times and you see that it is kind of blurred, it's really just that hind leg. It's the hind leg that you're seeing in the blurring of it. So this is another one that is a bobcat, but was misidentified. This is a series of photos that someone took of an animal that they believe to be a mountain lion. And you'll note that it is that kind of short fur, right? And it's that tan coloration. And there isn't really a whole lot in this photo for scale. But the one thing that I like to refer to are the grape leaves. So these are Concord grape leaves, and everyone, is kind of familiar with that, right? And we don't know how far away from the tree line this animal is, but it's pretty close. And so you can probably make the assumption that its face is about the size of a big grape leaf, right? And so a few more photos of that. You can also see this animal has a white muzzle and a white chin like a mountain lion does. But then as we see this animal creeping away, we see no tail at all, which bobcats do have a tail, and we'll talk about that later. But you definitely don't see that long J-shaped tail that you would see on a mountain lion. And the other characteristic you see here, you see the face ruff here. You see all the spotting on the inside of the leg, which is something that bobcats have, that spotting, mountain lions do not. And then the real kicker is the big white patch on the back of the ear is a characteristic that bobcats have that mountain lions do not. And so just to kind of put this in context here, that mountain lions are much, much larger than bobcats, and bobcats do range in size too, and we'll talk about that later, that in warmer climates they might be a little bit more smaller body, but really mountain lions are these are massive creatures, right? And bobcats are bigger than your house cat, but substantially smaller than a mountain lion. So with all of that, we know that we've already said we don't have a viable population of mountain lions here, but does that mean that mountain lions are never here or have never moved back into Massachusetts? No, there have been cases of mountain lions confirmed in New England in the Northeast. And there have been 2 cases here in Massachusetts that have been confirmed. So one in 1997 here at Quabbin. This was in New Salem. And John McCarter, who is a professional wildlife tracker and tracking instructor, so a very credible source, very knowledgeable individual about wildlife and wildlife sign, was walking through the area, and he located what he knew to be a cache made by a cat. So cats will partially eat some of the food that they catch and then bury it to come back to and feed on later. And he noted that it was far too large for a bobcat cache because it was about 8 feet long. And when he investigated a little bit further, he found that it contained some beaver entrails and jaw bones, which certainly something that a bobcat could take. But again, the size of this cache was pretty telling. He searched around and found 2 cat mounds. So cats like to cover their excrement after they go to the bathroom. They'll pile on some dirt and kind of hide it. And he found 2 mounds containing scats, and one of those scats was almost a foot long. So he knew, okay, this is definitely not a bobcat. It's clearly a cat from the way that it covered the scat. And so they were able to collect those scat samples, sent them in to reputable labs, and it was confirmed that it was a mountain lion. So there was DNA evidence in addition to the cache site and the mounds to demonstrate that there was in fact a mountain lion here at Quabbin. And then the second confirmed case that we've had here in Massachusetts was a few years later in 2011, again at Quabbin, this time at the Gate 8 boat launch. And DCR forester at the time, Steve Ward, was walking the cove, and he located these tracks that were very obviously cat tracks, and they were very large cat tracks. So he took really good photographs, documented this really well, and those photos were shared with 4 professional tracking experts across North America, all of whom confirmed that this was mountain lion. So there was no DNA evidence associated. There was no hair, no blood, no fecal sample or anything to test and to confirm. But these tracks were so fresh and so clear that there was no question that a mountain lion had left these tracks and that it wasn't an animal like a bobcat. I suppose it's possible it could have been the same one. Yeah, that would have been reasonable to think that it could have been the same animal. Yeah. So I think you were asking, could the 1997 cat have been the same as the 2011 cat? Yeah, and I think it's possible. Yeah, sure. Yep. So just 3 months after these tracks were found at Quabbin, a young adult male mountain lion was struck and killed on a highway in Milford, Connecticut. So this is irrefutable proof that mountain lions can be in New England, right? And so the interesting thing about this cat, though, is that it was so well documented. Its whole journey was incredibly well documented. And what do I mean by that? Well, so this cat actually originated in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So obviously when it was struck on the highway, we have a carcass, you can take samples, and the DNA profile of that animal indicated one that had originated from the Black Hills of South Dakota, 1,800 miles away. And just a few days before the cat was hit here in Milford, there was a scat sample collected in nearby Greenwich. That scat sample matched, the DNA matched exactly. It was the same individual that was hit. There were also DNA samples from scat and from fur that were collected in Lake George, and also 3 different spots in Wisconsin and 1 spot in Minnesota, all that were confirmed to be that same individual cat. And then these other spots along the way were other credible documentation of a mountain lion that was almost certainly the same individual. So all of this is to say that one mountain lion that ultimately met its demise here in Connecticut was very well tracked, basically. And so this single individual left all of this evidence. And so the point is that if we had mountain lions here in any frequency, they would be leaving all sorts of evidence like caches and kill sites and tracks and fur and scat, and eventually carcasses of animals, just like they exist out in the Western United States where the species is common and abundant. They regularly get hit on roadways. So if we had mountain lions here in any frequency, we would have all of the evidence like this single individual left over 1,800 miles over a 1.5 year time while it was traveling through. And so Megan is going to switch over and talk about our next extirpated species, wolves. Yeah. Well, we're keeping questions to the end, but see, I'm sure there are no issues.
I wonder too if you that might have been me. If you click the chat, I'm wondering how to, that bar is like remaining there like it wants us to, yeah. So, and then if you X out of that, because I think that's just in there. Oh, and then beautiful. Okay, we can see a little bit more there. Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, like Sue said, I'm gonna talk about the other historic predator that we'll be discussing today, which is wolves. So wolves, they were once common across mainland Massachusetts, and beyond that, they once ranged across the United States and outside of the contiguous United States as well, but we'll be kind of just thinking about the contiguous US. But like I said, common across our state historically. And then think of that physical description. In length, they're usually up to about 6 feet in length, including their tail, and their weight somewhere between 70 to 100 pounds. That could be a little bit higher if, again, you were looking at wolves in another portion of the state, but the ones that were historically found in Massachusetts were somewhere between 70 and 100. They do have these sort of shorter, more rounded ears compared to other members of the Canidae family. They have a more rounded, kind of broader nose than, again, other members that might have more of like a pointed tapering nose. And if we were to look at a couple other things, they do have quite long, kind of lanky legs compared to the rest of their body, and they often have quite hefty paws, pretty large feet, certainly typically bigger than most domestic dogs. So pretty large animal. Let's try again. No, it's fine. So we can take a look at our range map here. So that historical range is represented by all of that sort of gray diagonal hash marks. You can really see used to range from all the way from Western US across to Eastern, and of course, including Massachusetts. But then their range at the time of listing as an endangered species, which was about the mid-1970s, you can probably just barely see this, let's see, right there. Yep, so just that little northern portion of Minnesota was their range at the time of listing, and that has expanded a bit since. We don't have that updated map, but it's just kind of these almost like these little pockets. I believe there's another pocket down here, but still pretty isolated populations there. We won't be talking much about those introductory efforts. One is like, I have no personal experience with that out here in Massachusetts. It's not really something on our plate here as biologists, but just noting that there are some kind of spread out populations in Western US. So again, here we are today in 2024, and we do not have an established wolf population here in Massachusetts. So sort of the same thing that Sue was saying with mountain lions, that's the case for wolves as well. We do not have like a self-sustaining, reproducing wolf population here in Mass. And sort of like, well, where did they go? And it's kind of a similar story to that mountain lion story, right? Sort of immediate competition with those colonizers competing for wild game. And of course, they were considered a threat to livestock, which was important for people's ability to feed their families here, but also their livelihoods. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony established a paid bounty in 1630. And I do believe that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first colony to have an established bounty on wolves, and then it kind of spread from there to other colonies. And that lasted for a little over a century. And throughout that century, there was sort of unregulated, incentivized, lethal take of wolves. And similar to the mountain lion, once again, wolves became extirpated from Massachusetts in the mid-1800s. And like we've said, currently no established population of wolves here. But we do also get reports of people wondering if they saw a wolf in their backyard. So we get photos, we get videos. We're always open to receiving that sort of information and reviewing those photos and videos and helping people identify the wildlife in their backyards and neighborhoods. And often when people do send us photos and videos and asking if it's a wolf, it's typically an eastern coyote. And they do have a lot of physical similarities. So I don't blame people for kind of starting to see that little mix up. And so today we're just going to point out a couple of their similarities and why they're a little bit similar, and their differences, of course, too. So we're going to talk a little bit about eastern coyotes for now. We'll jump back to them later, but there's a good reason why eastern coyotes do have a lot of physical similarities, why they look like wolves. And it's because Massachusetts historically did not have coyotes at all. There was only the western coyote that was ranging, kind of represented by this darker orange here, ranged from the Rocky Mountains to the Great Plains in the 1800s. But then when those wolves became extirpated in Massachusetts and beyond, and the conversion of the forests into farmland from settlers, sort of opened the opportunity for those western coyotes to move eastward. And that's exactly what they did. So in the 1900s, those western coyotes started moving eastward. And as they were moving eastward, there wasn't always another western coyote to mate with. And so occasionally they would mate with domesticated dogs and with those remnant wolves that were just sort of remaining. And what we ended up with is that the canid that got established here in Massachusetts, the eastern coyote, has mixed DNA. It is, large majority of it is western coyote DNA. So 60 to 84% of eastern coyote DNA is western coyote DNA. But then there is this little bit of sprinkling of wolf DNA and this little bit of sprinkling of domestic dog DNA. And that is the reason why it's a little easy to mix these guys up, because coyotes do have some traits that might remind you of the wolf. So their legs are fairly long. The coyote's legs are a little bit shorter than the gray wolf. They will be seen in all different colors, coyotes will be, and that's actually a tribute to their domestic dog DNA, but people will see that variation in color, maybe especially when they're a little bit more gray. And especially in the winter time is when we get a lot of reports, because coyotes, they got to survive the winter just like we do, right? They got to layer up. So they have that really nice thick fur that does attribute to that wolf DNA as well. So this is a coyote in cooler weather coat, nice and thick. So say if you were to see a coyote today, there's a good chance that coyote has a nice thick coat. But then sort of that same coyote in the summer weather, it's going to have a much thinner coat, make it look more of its true body size. And if we're talking about body size too, again, gray wolves, they're somewhere between 70 to 100 pounds. Eastern coyotes, they're more 30 to 45 pounds. So there is a size difference there too. But eastern coyotes are bigger than western coyotes because of that wolf DNA. A little bit of a mix up there. What's kind of neat, and you can try your hand at this if you'd like, is the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife created a fun little online ID quiz to help people start to spot those differences between wolves and coyotes. So we thought we'd try a little bit of it now. So here's your first photo, and you can think in your head, do you think got wolf or coyote? You could put a 1 up if you think it's a coyote, a 2 up if you think it's a wolf. Could be either if you want. I see a couple 1s out there. All right. Nice. So 1 was coyote. Absolutely right. Hopefully you're looking at those larger ears. Coyotes have nice, tall, pointed, larger ears. Pretty narrow snout. You get a good view at it there. And look, those paws, not very big. And it's wintertime, you can tell with the snow, right? So they do have that thicker coat. What do you think? Wolf or coyote or wolf? So 1 for coyote, 2 for wolf. A little bit, I know. Animals, they're living things. They're moving fast. You gotta, you're not always gonna get the perfect look at it. So I see a mix of 1s and 2s. This is, yeah, so someone in our room said big feet. That's a great thing to look at, those bigger feet. So this is a yearling wolf, which means that it's a young wolf. So it's a little bit tricky too, but you can see those shorter ears, that broader muzzle, and then, yeah, nice or longer legs, little lanky looking, little gangly, and then nice big feet. What do you think? Coyote or wolf? Oh, we have a lot of confident coyotes here in the room, maybe some outline too. It is a coyote, nice. So thicker fur, people see that thick fur and that thick tail, but you were looking, I'm sure, for those nice tall ears, that narrow muzzle, and shorter legs there. You'd see small feet. And then this is our last one. Oh, so many confident wolves in here too. Okay, great. You guys are crushing it. This is a wolf, yes. So shorter ears, rounded, broad muzzle, longer legs. And if you could see those paws underneath the snow, they're a bit bigger. There's a lot more on that quiz. So maybe we can share the link to that afterwards if you want to give it a go. Oregon did a really nice job with that. Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. But there is one confirmed wolf case here in Massachusetts that we wanted to talk about today. And this one occurred in October of 2007 in Shelburne Falls. So leading up to this, there was multiple incidences of young and adult sheep that were being preyed upon by something. And so people in the area were on a little bit of a high alert. There was sort of an assumption that it was either a coyote doing the damage or potentially just a large domesticated dog. And so the animal returned to a farm and the farmer was there and, you know, his property was being actively damaged. And so he lethally took that animal. And then as, you know, we got out there and had an opportunity to take a look at that animal, we realized that it was in fact an adult male wolf. Oh, and yeah, so DNA confirmation of that as well. So not a domesticated dog, not a coyote, but certainly an adult male wolf. But there is still a little bit of debate about where it originated from. So there was DNA collected from this animal with maybe some attempt of trying to figure out where it came from, but it's not totally confirmed yet. So there's sort of two thoughts. One is that it could have originated from one of the closest wild wolf populations, which is in Ontario. Maybe it was just like a long-ranging dispersing male that found its way here to Massachusetts. Or the other possibility is that it was a captive wolf that was released into the wild. So maybe someone somehow got their hands onto a wolf pup, decided they wanted to raise it, realized how hard that was, and how that wolf was not a dog, or a domestic dog, I should say, and then released it into the wild. And that's maybe how it found its way to Mass. So not totally confirmed, but those are two likely scenarios. So we've talked about our two historic predators, our mountain lions, our wolves, and we're going to move into our present day mammalian predators. We do have a hand in the room. Did you have a question? Yeah, so me and Sue were talking a little bit about that, about the closest wolf population, and so it does seem like that's Ontario, Canada. I don't know how many there are. I don't know the would you say healthy size, like certainly established. So yeah. Yeah. And just for our online folks, we were just chatting about whether there's a healthy population of wolves up in Canada. So certainly Ontario. Yeah. And so I'm gonna keep plugging us along here into our present day mammalian predators. So these are the predators that are quite common and abundant across our state. And we might as well jump on into the coyote because we're already chatting about them. So just a reminder of what these critters look like. So they're medium-sized canids. They're more truly the size of a border collie. So females, they range somewhere between like 33 and like 40-ish pounds, 43 pounds, and the males somewhere between 34 and 47. It's very, very rare for an eastern coyote to exceed 50 pounds. That would be an exceptionally large coyote. So really more between 30 and 45. And again, if you keep that wolf in mind, they were 70 to 100. Their length, 4 to 5 feet, including that tail, and their appearance, they do have kind of longer legs, that narrow nose, those pointed ears. They do have quite a bit of variation in their color. So sometimes we get really neat photos of really dark coyotes, reddish coyotes, and that's thought to be tied to that domestic dog DNA that they have in them, that variation. And they have really thick fur, especially during those winter months. Makes them appear quite large. So now we got a little true and false question, which is true or false? Coyotes currently live in almost every city and town in Massachusetts. So we got a lot of trues here in the room. Maybe our folks at home are thinking about this too. It certainly is true. So they are established across mainland Massachusetts, every city and town, including very, very developed areas like Boston and Worcester and Springfield. And so a very common question we get after that point is it safe for coyotes to be in these cities and towns, and especially be in neighborhoods and in these very developed areas in close proximity to people, right? So those sightings are common. Absolutely, they're common. And the mere presence of a coyote isn't alone a public safety threat. But the reason why they're found in yards and neighborhoods is because of the human-associated food sources that we so easily provide outside our homes and businesses. Coyotes, they are opportunistic omnivores, which means they're going to eat a whole lot of anything they can find. And we as people, when we put bird feeders out, we have outdoor pet food, we have unsecured trash, we have open compost, we have overripe vegetables in our gardens and fallen fruit from our trees. I could go on forever, right? Coyotes, they are just so well adapted to eat a whole lot of anything. And so, you know, if you're concerned about the presence of coyotes in your neighborhood, just secure those food sources and it'll give them less of a reason to come close to our homes and get too comfy around people. But the unfortunate reality is that they will view our unprotected outdoor cats and small dogs as potential food sources. So that is a source of conflict for sure. And they will view medium and large-sized dogs as potential competition for mate in space. And that's especially true during the mating season, which is what we're in now through early March, and still holds true through the denning season, which we'll be transitioning into shortly from April to May. So we just really recommend that people directly supervise their pets whenever they're outside, ideally on a 6-foot or shorter leash, and keeping cats indoors if possible, but they do have cat leashes these days too, so you could always give that a try as well. And then the last thing that we recommend that people do is to haze coyotes whenever they're in their yard. So hazing, you could kind of switch it out with that word harass or frighten. It's a technique used to deter an animal from an area, to change its behavior. And really, it's our way of being able to speak coyote. Coyotes, they communicate with one another by chasing each other out of their territories, and we just need to do the same. We got to use that dominant body language and let them know that we're the dominant ones. People are the dominant ones in the relationship with coyotes. Luckily, it's super easy to haze a coyote. There's a lot of things you can do in your toolkit. So the goal is just to you can make really loud, offensive, unusual sounds. Even like honking a horn, although that's kind of loud to us, those coyotes, they probably hear horn honking every day, especially in a developed area. That's not going to be enough to deter them. So you could do things like let off an air horn. That's a whole lot more powerful. You could use a whistle, a kazoo if you're feeling musical too. That's fine. You could throw objects in their direction. So tennis balls, small pebbles, sticks, with the intent to frighten but not injure the animal, just frightening them. You could spray it with a hose or a water gun. I don't like to be unexpectedly soaked with water. Neither do coyotes. So you could do that and that'll kind of chase them off. Or you can just use your own body. Use aggressive, dominant body language. Make eye contact, walk toward that coyote with confidence, wave your hands above your head and say, hey, coyote, get out of here. This is my space. And do that until they have fully left the area, until they have fully left. So make sure you're not doing this from inside and like trying to yell out your back door, like, get out of here, and like run back in. That's not going to be effective. You got to fully commit to hazing those coyotes. And you can get creative, right? So don't do the same thing every time because the coyote might realize, oh, this isn't actually a threat to me. Switch it up, keep it variable, encourage your neighbors to do the same thing. And if you're all doing it every time you see the coyote in your neighborhood, the more effective that hazing is going to be. And it's good for the coyote, it's good for people, it's good for our pets, helps us coexist. Yeah. So you can, yes. So just for our folks online, ask like, what if there was 3 or 4 of them in your yard? So you can absolutely do that in those circumstances. We do have a print off, I swear, maybe it's in my bag, but we have a print off of tips on how to effectively haze coyotes that gives some details. I know sometimes where people are like, well, what about this situation? Or what about that? Because you know your unique situation. And that kind of runs through a little bit of that that we can provide, or we can just talk about it after the presentation for sure. But I think that's the end of my spiel, and I'm going to pass it back to Sue to kind of run through our remaining points here. Sure. I can maybe start this answer, sure. But so it's a little dependent. So our friend in the room here asked about the territory of coyotes, and that's really gonna depend on the food sources available. So coyotes can have smaller home ranges or smaller territories if they can find all the food that they need in a smaller space. And so that's why coyotes can live in denser populations in areas where they're getting supplemental food from us as people. So it's really all about the amount of food and resources that are available to them. So their home range will actually fluctuate. So if they're really just relying on natural food sources, they're going to have a bigger home range. I think it's like if a coyote is really using human associated food sources, it can be as small as 5 square miles, which is quite small. Yeah. Anything you'd add?
Yeah, and in those environments, more rural environments where they're focused on more natural food sources, those home ranges might exceed something like 30 square miles. So they're having to cover much more ground in order to find the food that they're dependent upon. And so you're also asking about how many others might there be in the area. So coyotes live in family groups, and the family group size can fluctuate quite a bit. And again, that all goes back to resource availability. The more resources, the more food available can support generally a larger family group of coyotes. Where food and other resources are scarce, family groups might just be a pair, a male and a female that breed, and then once their pups are grown, they get kicked out to figure it out on their own, because there's just not enough food to go around. So we're going to switch back to cats. And since I talked about mountain lions earlier and I talked a little bit about bobcat, I'm going to give some more detail on the bobcat. Again, this is our native cat here, our one feline species, native wild feline species that we have here in Massachusetts, where they are pretty common and abundant. They're pretty much statewide. We do have cats documented on Cape Cod now at this point, so they're pretty much everywhere except for the islands. Again, this is a medium-sized feline. They're about twice the size of your average house cat. They're just like in mountain lions, there's that sexual dimorphism where males tend to be quite a bit bigger than females. Males are about a third bigger than females. These animals average, they're pretty small. They average anywhere from like 15 to 35 pounds. A 40-pound tomcat is that's a really a big animal. They're about 2 to 4 feet long. And I mentioned their appearance a little bit about that earlier. So they do have this short bobbed tail, which is, of course, is where they get that common name, the bobcat. There's some misconception out there. Some folks think the bobcats don't have any tail at all. They do. It's just a little nubbin, but in some instances, it can be almost a foot long. So there is a fair bit of variability in the length of bobcat tails. As I mentioned earlier, they have that prominent face ruff. This is something that is also you see in the Canada lynx, right? So they've got that big kind of like Elizabethan collar almost around their throat and chin. I mentioned the white patches. You can't see it in this photo. You can a little bit. Bobcats have that white patch on the back of the ear, white tip tail as well. And in the winter, they're looking a lot like, most of them are going to look like this animal here, where they have this very fluffy coat. They tend to have much more spotting for that winter coat, and that's serving as camouflage when there's less foliage. That's helping them to blend in a little bit better and to effectively hunt throughout the winter. And then in the summer, they tend to have that shorter fur, and it's oftentimes much more of a rufous red kind of color and more uniform. There are some cats that will still have a bit of spotting in their summer coat, but oftentimes it's just kind of that solid reddish rufous color. And so here's another example of a photo that was sent to us by a member of the public that believed that they saw a mountain lion. Again, it's got that real short fur. It's that reddish color. You really don't see any spotting on this animal. You do see the short tail, right? And you do see the white patches. And so this is very clearly a bobcat, but you can see there's quite a difference between, and this isn't the same individual, of course, but you can see the general differences between a winter coat versus a warmer summer coat. And so through the slide in here, this was from an article from a number of years ago, with a picture of a cat that has this nice black barring right on the forelegs, which bobcats have, mountain lions do not. But yet you see the title of this news story, you know, and sort of like, oh, it's under debate, right? Like, or it's debatable or it's disputable. Nope, this is just a bobcat. And so we kind of put this slide in there to remind you all that now you have more knowledge about differentiating between mountain lions and bobcats. And so when you see something like this, whether it's in the media or it's on social media or a friend or family member shares a photo of an animal, you can take a look at that with a more critical and educated eye now and be able to say, nope, this is just a bobcat. And keeping in mind that the simplest and most likely explanation is almost always the correct one. So it's much more likely that you're seeing a common and abundant species, the bobcat, than you are seeing something super rare like a mountain lion in Massachusetts. So a little bit about bobcat behavior. These animals, unlike coyotes, they are really a true carnivore. They're a species that is very heavily dependent on prey items that they're catching and killing themselves. They will do a little bit of scavenging if they have the opportunity to feed on something like a fresh roadkill. They're pretty picky about it, and it needs to be fresh. But really, they're so focused on eating other animals. So that can be anything from insects to amphibians, reptiles, rodents, smaller mammals like things like squirrels, and cottontail rabbit, snowshoe hare. Those are all real common food sources for these animals. And they will eat deer. They won't very frequently take down a very healthy deer. Like that's a huge animal for a bobcat to be able to take down. But adult male bobcats can and have been known to take down an adult deer, but more often they're taking the opportunity for a wounded deer or compromised deer or deer fawns. But they're not actively feeding on deer much of the time. So when food is plentiful, I mentioned this earlier, talking about mountain lions, a common cat practice is to kill more than you can eat in one sitting, and then you sort of hide it. So they'll cache it. They'll hide it under some leaf litter and branches. Sometimes if it's small enough, they might bring it up into a tree. But most often, bobcats are creating those ground caches where they're saving food to come back and feed on it again later. These animals, generally speaking, they're very shy, elusive, tend to be solitary unless it's a female with her kittens. We are seeing, though, that bobcats, like coyotes, are doing incredibly well in suburban environments. So they are seen pretty frequently. So we think of them, historically, we thought of them as these really shy, elusive animals that needed large tracts of forest. Now we're learning that, no, they do really well in suburbia, and they, like other wildlife species, get a little bit more comfortable around people, just not quite as comfortable as coyotes seem. They tend to be, they still tend to be more on the elusive side. So even though we have bobcats regularly living among people and living in these suburban environments, we very rarely have conflict with humans and bobcats. Bobcats really, they're not that species that you need to be terribly concerned about in terms of you're leaving your cat or your dog outside. It's probably not a bobcat that's gonna be a potential threat, much more likely a coyote, but not a whole lot of conflicts. We do occasionally have instances where bobcats will take the opportunity to take livestock, especially backyard chickens, which are really common, especially in suburbia nowadays. And as long as they're unprotected and there's really no security measures being taken, it's a pretty easy food source. So they will occasionally prey on livestock and chickens. So to switch gears away from cats and dogs, we're going to go to the other big predator, mammalian predator that we have here on the landscape, and that is the American black bear. While they are taxonomically classified as carnivores, they are very much an omnivore. Much more of what they consume is plant material. They will consume meat matter, but it's usually something that they're able to scavenge or come across very easily. So bears are not known to expend a tremendous amount of energy trying to chase down food resources or prey items. They're putting all of their energy into consuming as many calories as they possibly can and as easily as they possibly can. So that's why I say they're my spirit animal in a lot of ways, because they, it's just their focus is just entirely gaining weight, which is great. So this is the only bear species here in the Northeast, in New England. Females, again, we have this difference where females tend to be smaller than males. They average about 150 to 200 pounds, but can be upwards of 400 pounds. We tend to see bigger bigger animals in those suburban locations where they're getting a lot of human associated food sources. They tend to be bigger bodied animals than those in more rural environments that are eating more natural food sources. Males, again, quite a bit bigger, averaging 200 to 300 pounds, but anywhere upwards 700, 800 pounds have been documented. These animals have very shaggy, thick black fur. They occasionally will have a white patch on the chest. It can be anything like a star, almost like this full bikini look, which is really cute when they have that. They occasionally, pretty rarely, you'll see what's called a cinnamon bear. It's a black bear. It's just more of a cinnamon color. It's just kind of like a different color phase. But the vast majority of them are that dark black in coloration. They do have a tan face and tan muzzle, rounded, medium-sized ears, and generally pretty small eyes and not the greatest eyesight. They depend almost entirely on that great big nose of theirs. So another little quiz for everyone. Where in Massachusetts do black bears exist? These are our 5 wildlife districts. Yes. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere except the islands. They're not in the Southeast or the Cape with great frequency, certainly not on the Cape with great frequency. We did have one that wandered down there back in 2012, but we're seeing more and more sightings of black bears down in the southeastern portion of the state and the northeastern portion of the state. And why is that? Well, that's because bears are expanding. The bear population is continuing to grow, and as that bear population grows, they tend to move. They're moving eastward into the unoccupied or underoccupied habitat, which is very abundant. So much like bobcats and coyotes, these are highly opportunistic animals. They're habitat generalists. They do incredibly well in suburban environments, and there's all sorts of suburban environments in the eastern portion of the state. So there's every reason to believe that with all of that habitat available, these animals are going to continue to move eastward. So the blue here is where we have established bear range. We have a healthy breeding population of bears. The orange is where we have documented breeding populations of bears, and they're moving eastward again. And then all this white area really is game for bear. There have certainly been bear sightings all through these areas, but we don't have established breeding populations just yet. But it really is only a matter of time. We've got a number of reproducing females that are right on the Worcester line and utilizing portions of Worcester and north of there as well. So and then statewide, we estimate our bear population to be anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 and growing. So this map, just to orient yourself, we've got Quabbin over here, Amherst, the Connecticut River, Northampton, Holyoke Range, and all the gray that you can see here is representing human development, really. These are really very busy urban, suburban environments. And then when I overlay, what I'm going to overlay is GPS data from our study black bears. These are all female bears that have radio collar or GPS collars on them. And every color and shape represents a different individual bear. So for example, like this purple here, this is all one bear. The green is all one bear, and then you see yellow and blue dots and blue squares. Every single one is a different bear, and all of the locations, the fixes for her where she was over a certain period of time. So you can see that a number of bears, and these are just collared bears, and these are just female bears, right? So this is a handful, every color. I never took the time to count how many different bears this is, but you can see it, it's fewer than 20 probably, right? So all of these bears are heavily using this area. And then there's all the male bears in the area. And then there's all the other female bears that we don't have collars on. And then there are all the cubs that these females have every other year that aren't collared. So you can see bears are everywhere here, right? And they're using our backyards, our habitats. They're using UMass Amherst campus. They're all around and coexisting pretty peacefully for the most part, especially out this way in Western Mass and Connecticut River Valley, part of the state where people have been living alongside black bears for many years now. Really not a big deal anymore. Like it's really cool. It's really exciting, but it's not something that people get particularly bothered by or find problematic. We've come to learn to coexist. Not to say that there aren't conflicts still in this part of the state and elsewhere. So why why are bears using these habitats? Why do they do so well in our backyards? And one of the reasons that they do so incredibly well, like Megan mentioned before, all those human associated food sources. And so we unfortunately make it really, really easy for omnivores, habitat generalists, opportunistic feeders to find food in our backyards, to find really high calorie foods in our backyards and make it really easy for them to acquire. So you can see this bear doing what all bears do and trying to get at that bird feeder. So there's a sort of common misconception that wildlife like bears and coyotes and bobcats and raccoons and opossums and skunks and foxes and wild turkeys and deer are in our backyards because they don't have anywhere else to go. You'll hear this from people all the time. Well, we're cutting down all the forests, or we're developing all of the land. These animals don't have anywhere else to go, so they're forced to live among us. Not really. They're here because they're opting to be here, and they're here because we're making it so darn accommodating for them. We're putting out bird feeders, we've got compost, we've got pet food, we've got decks that you can den under, we've got all sorts of great habitat components that we provide among our homes. These animals are opting to live alongside us because we make it really easy to make a living as a wild animal. And we're pretty welcoming about it too. Like, people are generally pretty nice, right? There's not enough of that hazing going on that Megan was talking about before, where you're giving these animals a hard time. You're like, no, you want to den under my deck this winter? Have at it. I'll even fill the bird feeder for you every single day, right? So that's why these animals are here. Bird feeder, when it comes to black bears, and a number of other wildlife will, coyotes too, wild turkeys will utilize bird feeders as well, but it's the #1 issue for bear conflicts when people have out bird feeders. Again, these animals, they're opportunistic and they're smart, and they have an incredible memory, and they will learn where bird feeders are. They will learn to associate people's backyards with that food resource. They will go back time and time again to investigate, and females teach their young that same behavior, the locations and the behavior of how to search for and find these food sources. So a question that we get oftentimes from the public, well, bears hibernate, right? They go into a winter den, so it must be safe for me to put out bird feeders in the winter. Not really. Not all bears go into a winter den, and there isn't a set time where they're in the den to they're emerging from the den. They can be in and out, or again, not in a den at all. So there really is no safe time of year to have bird feeders out. And one of the resources that we brought today, you can find more information on our website too. This is a really great pamphlet that talks about how you can make your backyard bird friendly without bird feeders. So we love that people love birds, and we love that people want to see birds and attract them to their properties, but we don't love so much the artificial feeding aspect of it. So there's lots that you can do in terms of planting native plants, seed-bearing, fruit-bearing, insect-attracting plants that also provide great nest structure. So you're giving them the food source, you're giving them the opportunity for nesting and successful reproduction. And then things like water features can be really helpful too. So if you feed birds and you're thinking like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do it anymore, then that's a really great resource to learn more about how you can continue to attract those animals to your backyard without creating this buffet for bears. Sure. So the question for those online was, does it apply to hummingbird feeders? And in my experience, I would say yes, but it's not so much that bears find the liquid as something that they're readily feeding on. They'll break it open and they'll lap it out and drink it. I think it's really much more of just that search image that they have of a bird feeder. And so we'll see them just going into backyards, and yeah, they're going to opt for the one with seed in it, but they're going to take down the hummingbird feeder too, because it looks like a bird feeder, and they've learned that behavior to tear that down. And sure, they'll drink the liquid out of it, but it's not like they're not drawn to the smell of the syrup or whatever necessarily. But yeah, it's that behavior of just taking anything that looks like a bird feeder down. And I'll never forget when my husband and I moved into our house, the previous owner had the shepherd's hooks for bird feeders. And we had a bear come through the first night that we moved in. There was no feeder. There hadn't been for months. but he or she just bent that thing in half because it just knew that wrought iron shepherd's hook was something associated with bird seed, right? And that was just a learned behavior. No food reward in it, but they did it anyway. So the other important potential food attractant in backyards for black bears and for bobcats and for coyotes and other predator species, backyard chickens and other types of livestock, especially anything that's free ranging or any livestock that isn't protected by electric fencing. And electric fencing really is the tool that needs to be used to protect your livestock from black bears. They're incredibly strong animals. They can climb just about anything. And so without electric fencing, it's really next to impossible to protect livestock and backyard chickens from a bear that wants to eat them. Same goes for apiaries, bees. If you maintain bees, we strongly suggest that you use electric fencing. And we do have a guide online on our webpage, on our website, Living with Bears, that's walks you through step by step all the materials that you need, how to set up an effective electric fencing array. And so just to wrap up the presentation, couple of really broad points that we try to make to whenever we're talking to members of the public about coexisting with wildlife. First and foremost, never intentionally feed wildlife. And I think probably everyone in the room and maybe a lot of the folks online know this already and don't do this, but it is unfortunate, an unfortunate reality that there are folks out there who are feeding wildlife beyond bird feeders, but doing things like this, putting out bowls of cat food or hand feeding animals. And this is hugely problematic. And it is linked to those cases where we do have human bites. They're rare, but they're almost always linked back to intentional hand feeding of wildlife. So never ever intentionally feed wildlife. It doesn't do any favors for the wildlife, and certainly isn't in people's best interest. And then that next step, removing those human associated food sources, that source of unintentional feeding. So whether it's bird feeders or it's trash or compost outside, or all of the number of things that Megan mentioned earlier, whether it's overripe fruits and vegetables in your garden, pet food, open compost bins, all of those sorts of things. And then third, always closely supervise your pets while they're outdoors. Never supervise from indoors, never supervise at any great distance, especially this time of year, particularly with coyote breeding season, and then the denning and pupping season. These animals, coyotes, highly territorial. They view dogs as direct competition. They view cats as food. So keep your house cat. They're house cats, right? Keep them in the house. They're going to be safest there. And then dogs, closely supervised, keep them leashed if you can. If you're someone who has a very high energy breed dog that needs off leash time, make sure that they have really good recall. They listen really well to commands like leave it. And just always keep your dog as close to you as you can, and keep good eyes on them to make sure that they're not posing a threat to wildlife and that wildlife isn't posing a threat to them. Okay. We made it. Thanks. You want to turn lights on? Okay. Turn lights on and we'll hop into.
If you could just help to dispel some of the myths of the vicious and evil fisher.
Of course. Of course. Yes. So we have a fisher pelt here. So yeah, as we mentioned earlier, there are lots of other mammalian mammals and mammalian predators here, and we've got all of the fur bearer species that exist in Massachusetts here. And so there are a number of others, the weasels being another one of those mammalian predators. So we've got the fisher, which is often erroneously referred to as the fisher cat. They're a weasel, they're not a cat. They do have semi-retractable claws, and they're it's that, I think, part of that fisher cat name came from it being kind of similar to the a polecat species. And so when colonists came over, they thought it was a cat-like species, but there's nothing cat about it. It's good and stinky like any weasel should be. And yeah, so yes. Oh, thank you. So the fisher, it's sort of like this medium-sized weasel species. Our largest weasel species here in Massachusetts is the river otter. And for whatever reason, fisher have this really horrible reputation that's not well earned at all. They are a ferocious predator. If you're a chipmunk, or if you're a cottontail rabbit, or you know, a rodent or something, yes, they're worth being afraid of. But as far as posing any kind of a threat to human health and safety, they just don't. They're, again, pretty shy, elusive. They don't want anything to do with people. They very rarely want anything to do with our pets. Occasionally we'll hear about a fisher getting into like backyard chickens. Sure, they'll take that opportunity. But really they're not this fearful, you know, animal that's worth being fearful of. They're fascinating, really cool animals. And the other thing you brought up was the vocalization, the screaming thing. So we hear that all the time, that, you know, someone heard a scream, and it sounds like a woman being murdered, or a baby, you know, screaming in the woods. It's almost always red fox, which are a very, very vocal species, particularly during their breeding season, pup rearing. That screaming sound, which we have in another presentation, but we probably don't have readily available, it's almost always red fox. Sometimes that screaming vocalization is something like a barred owl, like a juvenile barred owl that's asking mom or dad for food. And it's not to say that fishers are non-vocal. They're just not very vocal animals. One reason being that they're highly solitary. So one of the reasons that animals are vocal, they're doing so to communicate with others of the same species. And so fisher, being a very solitary animal, they don't really have the need to be vocal. So they're much more focused on scent marking and communicating with scent. So they do make some vocalizations, some chattering, some barking type sounds are the more common vocalizations. And there is a sort of scream that they can make, and that we have documentation of in captivity, and particularly in young animals under a tremendous amount of stress. But that scream is distinctly different than that red fox scream that people commonly hear and think is fisher. Yes.
Very like
Okay. I wish we had that presentation up, because we do have that, but maybe we can retrieve that. It's not, I don't have an exact website to point you to, but you can search pretty easily on YouTube. And if you find anything that's from like a Fish and Wildlife agency, which is one of the examples that I had in a previous presentation that we did that had the audio, there's a really good one that I forget which agency, it might have been Oregon again, I don't remember. But it's video of a red fox making that vocalization. And another thing that you'll see, like you can search for like fisher screaming on YouTube and you'll find all sorts of videos, but there's never a video of a fisher making that vocalization. It's always just someone like, it's always just the audio like into the black forest. So you never actually see the animal that's making the vocalization. The one exception is that video that we have, which you can also search on YouTube, Cape Wildlife Fisher. And so this was a rehabilitation facility in Barnstable on the Cape that had 2 juvenile fisher in at the facility, and it was under tremendous stress, and it was making a screaming vocalization. But again, it's very different than that red fox vocalization. Yes.
I'm not sure whether human. It was just last year. It reported environmental police came up. What do you think would make the bobcats start attacking humans?
Yeah, so we have had a few instances of bobcats attacking humans, and they've all been rabid, confirmed to be rabid. And rabies it's not incredibly common in bobcat, but it's not incredibly uncommon either. And so the instances where we have had human attacks by bobcat, those have been confirmed to be rabid animals. Yes.
And the man came across the street and just threw me a cat. Anyway, and then I hiked up the road and a female.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so for folks online, sorry, I wasn't repeating questions, but that was just a little anecdotal story about Fisher and it not being tremendously vocal, at least in that screaming sense. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So for folks online, the question is about why would, back to the mountain lion and it traveling all the way from the Black Hills of South Dakota, why in the world would it make that trek? So this was a young male individual, and we do see in mountain lions and in a number of other species that young males will make these really large treks as they're trying to establish their own breeding range. And so that's all part of expansion of a species, and as a species is maybe attempting to recolonize an area, or even when they're well established, they have to travel outside of their natal range because they don't want to breed with their mom and their sisters, and so they need to find others of their species well outside of that home, that natal range of theirs. And then males will do these really long distance dispersals. That far is unusual. They're not usually going, 1,800 miles, but it's not unheard of. Yes.
Question about
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
down here.
Yeah. Yep. Yes. Yep. So for folks online, the question is about coyote vocalizations and how many coyotes there are making those noises and what are they doing? What in the world are they doing? Did they just kill something? So that's something we hear often, that that's a common misconception, that coyotes are broadcasting the fact that they just took down prey, which is not at all the case. So coyotes, when they're very vocal like that, they're communicating with their family members, and they're most vocal during that pup rearing later in the summer, early fall. They're teaching their young how to maintain a home range. They're teaching them how to be a coyote, and they're communicating with them over generally longer distances. So so that's what all of that vocalization is generally about. And again, if you think about, the idea of broadcasting that you just preyed on something, it doesn't make any sense biologically that an animal would put in all of this, exert all of this energy to take something down, then to tell everybody else in the forest, hey, come and have some. Like, an animal's not going to do that. It just doesn't make any sense. And then the other point that you brought up about how many, it can actually be really deceiving. Just a couple of coyotes can sound like 7, 8, 10 coyotes. And we hear this all the time. Like, I've got so many it must be 20 or 30 coyotes in my backyard. And it's actually this really kind of cool thing that coyotes and other wild canids do. It's this auditory illusion that it's kind of this echoing, and how the noise moves through the environment. It amplifies it and makes it sound like it's numerous individuals, and that's sort of an evolutionary trait that they've adapted to, because they're so territorial. They're making it sound like there's a whole bunch of us over here. You better watch out. Like, don't come and mess with us, kind of thing, because there are 20 of us, when really it's like 3 or 4 individuals. Yeah. So it can be very deceiving. It might just be 2 or 3 individuals that you're hearing, or it could be a family group that's on the bigger side, that's more like 8 individuals. Yeah. Yeah. Were there any more? Yes, Don.
I don't think that
Correct. Yeah. So we don't have an established population. If we had evidence of female with kittens or an active den site, that would be an indication of a viable population. But the animals, the 2 instances of mountain lions that we have had confirmed in Massachusetts were almost certainly males that were dispersing. That one in 2011, where we just had the tracks here at Quabbin, no DNA. 3 months later, the young male mountain lion was struck in Connecticut. Pretty good guess that that was likely the same individual. But again, we didn't have DNA to compare. But it was a pretty safe assumption that that was the same cat that had moved through from the Lake George area down through likely through Quabbin, and it could have been here for, you know, those 3 months, you know. So it's not to say that those individuals, when they're here, that we know about it instantly. We don't. And that individual went around 3 months being relatively undetected, right? There might have been some folks that maybe saw tracks or saw an animal, but didn't have any proof to go along with that in terms of like another scat sample or something. So they can certainly be in the area and be relatively undetected for some period of time. But as they move across the landscape, they're going to be subject to being detected. Yes. That's so nice. Megan, plug away.
That's what. That's hard. So this.
So for folks online, we're just shamelessly plugging the Mass Wildlife Magazine. Check it out. And you can find a couple of the issues. Examples that we have here in person is our latest issue of the Mass Wildlife Magazine with a full article on the eastern coyote. And then there's another that we have a copy of that written some time ago, 2015, I think, on mountain lions in Massachusetts. And it tells the whole story of the confirmed cases that I talked about in the presentation, as well as a bit about that Connecticut mountain lion. And then there's also some really great content in that article about all of the times that people think they're seeing mountain lions, but didn't actually. One more question. Yeah. Yeah, so the species that we talked about, all of our native mammal predators are all doing really well. They're really populations are well established, healthy populations. They're common and abundant animals. We don't have any mammalian species, predator species that are considered threatened or endangered here in Massachusetts. Bats would be the exception of like mammals that are, you know, have any listing status. I think at this point it's most of our bat species. Yeah.
Our native bat species are on the list, and maybe possibly 6. I think they might have just put 6 on. So more than half of our native bats are listed, at least statewide and some federally, as endangered.
Is that because of the white nose?
Largely, yes. Also, you know, habitat loss and chemicals and the whole variety of things, but the white nose syndrome is a large part of it. Yeah, so we've had some folks online who've been waiting for questions. So if you folks want to hear what questions they have, you're more than welcome to stay.
All right, so we'll flip to online for a moment here, which we have our first question is, are coyotes a major cause of fawn and deer kills? And this is actually something that we ended up talking about in our coyote article. If you're interested in that, is that coyotes do prey on white-tailed deer. They do take fawns. They will eat fawns, especially when they're first dropped. So those young fawns in May and June, and they will take adult white-tailed deer as well. But again, typically more a white-tailed deer that is compromised in some way. So injured, whatever it might be. But based on the research that has been done, it's not, what is the words I want to use? It's not necessarily something that has a substantial negative impact on the white-tailed deer population. So the deer that are taken by coyotes, it's been found that that same amount of deer would have died from some other source of mortality. So it's not additive, if that makes sense. So if they weren't taken by a coyote, they likely would have died from some other issue, something like malnutrition or vehicle or whatever it might be, these other added kind of sources of mortality. So coyotes don't have an additive impact on the white-tailed deer predation rates. More about that in our article. We actually kind of shouted that out specifically because we do commonly get that question. So thank you for asking it. And then we have another question here, which is, I think these two questions are the same. So will bobcats go after beavers in their lodges? Or in or out of their lodges? I think one slightly different. I actually don't know too much about bobcat behavior. Do you want to chime in on this one, sir?
Yeah, so bobcats will prey on beaver, but I doubt very much that they would go after a beaver in the lodge. So if you know a little about the construction of a beaver lodge, the entry is underwater. So the way that a beaver gets into its home, into its lodge, is through one or two openings that are under the surface of the water. It kind of tunnels under, and then they can get up into the den. So I would highly doubt that a bobcat would be motivated enough to dive underwater to then enter a lodge. But outside of the lodge, beaver are definitely susceptible to predation, and and bobcat will certainly prey on them if the opportunity arises. But a beaver is a big animal to tangle with, and I would argue that many beaver probably outweigh your average bobcat. So I think that beaver kits are probably certainly much more susceptible to predation than adult beavers. Adult beavers really don't have a tremendous number of predators because they are pretty huge, and they can be a pretty huge animal. So will a bobcat take the opportunity to take a beaver? Yes, if it's worth the risk. But I don't think it's super common for bobcats to be taking on the risk of attacking a beaver. I wouldn't tangle with a beaver.
See another question line, but I'll do just one more check here.
And for those of you in person, feel free to come up and look at the different pelts. You can ask questions about any of these other species. So again, we do have the other mammalian predator species: red fox, gray fox. We've got raccoon, skunk up here, which are also in their own right predators. And then we've got the river otter, we've got Trojan fisher, we've got the American mink, and we also have a long-tailed weasel. I think the ermine or short-tailed weasel is missing from the bunch. Please feel free to come up and take a look. And we also have some skulls that you can look at too.
Thank you again very much.
Thank you.